The first thing that you're going to need from this PowerPoint is a timeline. Again, we are going to be doing timelines for each of the major time periods that we discuss. We did a very brief one over the River Valley civilizations. This one is over our classical era civilizations. And then usually it's the start of a certain civilization's history, their rise to prominence, or in some cases, certain individuals who had a pretty large historical impact. 600 BCE, you see the beginnings of Zoroastrianism in Iran, a very early monotheistic religion that may have influenced religions such as Judaism, Christianity, and even much later Islam. Again, back in these days, most people were still polytheistic. They believed in many gods, but Zoroastrianism was at least one of the earlier ones that believed that there was just one God. Somewhere between 551 BCE and 233 BCE, you see the rise of two very influential Chinese philosophers, Confucius and Lao Tzu. They're the founders of the belief systems Confucianism and Taoism. Learn more about those later. About 550 BCE, near modern-day Iran, they were adherents of Zoroastrianism. By and large, you see the beginnings of the Persian Empire, which for many years was the largest empire in all of human history. 542 BCE, in modern-day India, you have the birth of the Buddha, previously known as Siddhartha Gautama. He grew up a Hindu Indian prince, but then found another way. The religion spread within India to some degree, but especially much later on during trade to the east and to the west. 500 BC, we see the start of the Greek wars with Persia. The Greek city-states, they enter into a pretty large conflict against the then Persian Empire. You've seen some of this perhaps depicted in movies such as 300. Near the same time period, a little bit further to the west in modern-day Italy, you see the start of the Roman Republic. Before they were an empire, they had a representative government in which the people actually voted on their leaders, probably borrowing the early concepts of democracy itself from their neighbors, the Greeks. 470 BCE, you have the height of Athens, Greece, one of their many city-states, known for their art, architecture, and academics in general. A lot of intellectual innovations come out of Athens. 330 BC, you have the conquests of Alexander the Great. For most of the history of ancient Greece, you're not talking about a united civilization. You're talking about a group of independent city-states who were similar in their language and in their culture, but politically not united. That all really changed with the invasion of Alexander's father, King Philip of Macedonia. And once his father died, Alexander the Great took over. His father was assassinated. Alexander the Great blamed the old enemy of the ancient Greeks, the Persians, and he set off on a conquest that effectively would end the then Persian Empire. Shortly thereafter, in India, South Asia, you see the beginnings of the Mauryan Empire, the first big empire to unite most of South Asia. And on the other side of the planet, in Mesoamerica, you see the height of the Maya civilization, very advanced for what they had to work with, around 300 BCE, but they do eventually decline and virtually disappear by the time we get to 900 CE. In 211 BCE, we see Qin Shi Huangdi become the first true blue emperor of China. His dynasty, the Qin dynasty, is the dynasty that gave China its name. Qin wasn't emperor for very long. He's kind of a cruel guy. You'll learn more about him later. But after the fall of the Qin dynasty, we get the much longer lasting Han dynasty, which really kind of sets the tone for a lot of the rest of China's history, at least while they were in the dynasty system. 27 BCE, Augustus rises to become the first true Roman emperor. No more republic. On comes the empire. Rome will soon encompass and take over most of the area surrounding the Mediterranean. One of the areas they included was modern-day Israel, and it was at the behest of the Roman governor Pontius Pilate and some other Jewish leaders that the local religious leader Jesus of Nazareth was crucified. And in the years that followed, Christianity was very taboo. Christians were persecuted. Eventually, though, the religion continues to spread, and eventually it becomes the religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine, the first Christian Roman emperor. 319, you have the start of the Gupta Empire. The Mauryan Empire under Ashoka was known for its sponsorship of Buddhism. Well, the Gupta will be equally known for its sponsorship of Hinduism, the most popular religion in South Asia to this day. 476 CE, you have the fall of the Roman Empire. The last Western Roman emperor is deposed. By this point, the Roman Empire had split in two, an eastern half, much more prosperous, and a declining western half. In the west, Europe enters the Dark Ages. The stability of Rome is gone, and barbarians literally take over, and this is when you start to see the beginnings of Middle Age Europe. Again, many hundred years, though, of Dark Ages. In the East, it should be noted, the Roman Empire carries on. They start becoming known, at least through history, as the Byzantine Empire, based out of Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. But the Roman Empire under the Byzantine will go on until the 1400s, close to another 1,000 years. And then finally, in East Asia, back to China, we see the start of the Sui dynasty in 589 CE. Again, if some of the things I didn't say made sense or sound completely alien to you, that is okay. You haven't really studied these people, these places just yet, at least most of it. But I think throughout this presentation, especially with your reading in tomorrow's videos, this will make more sense. So definitely have this Classica era timeline in your notebook. I would highly recommend you write these down as well. While I'm not going to officially require them, these are very valuable notes because they give you a insight into some of the key characteristics, some of the key themes that are taking place during the classical era. Later on in the week, you've got an essay. I think some of this information would be very beneficial for you to maybe include somehow in your essay. But again, I'm not going to require you write it in your notebook, but definitely pay attention to it. So these are some key things that are going on in the period of 600 BCE to 600 CE. First, the conquest and growth of empires. The idea of empire, the idea of a well-placed civilization with manpower and resources going and taking over more and more territory to rule over. Diverse territories geographically, culturally, with usually one person ultimately in charge, or maybe even a group of people. You see a lot of empires. A lot of the most famous empires in all of human history come out of this time period. You've got the Persians, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. It was the first dynasty of many Persian empires, but the Achaemenid were the ones in this period. You've got the Greeks, sometimes united, usually not. But especially once Alexander the Great shows up and his Hellenistic Empire, which we'll explain what in the world that means here in a little bit, you do see Alexander take over the Persian Empire and very briefly have the largest empire in human history up to this point. Further back to the west, centered around modern-day Italy, you have the Roman Empire. Built thousands of miles of roads to unite their empire, incorporated a lot of different groups. Eventually, they get so big that it's hard to protect, so they split the empire into eastern and western halves. 476, the West falls. It's the end of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Dark Ages in Europe. But in the East, the Roman Empire lives. They are just the Byzantine Empire. And we'll be talking about the Byzantine for a while because they're around to the mid 1400s. You have the Mauryan Empire, the first big empire to take over most of South Asia, aka India. Really, their most famous emperor was Ashoka, a Hindu who converted to Buddhism and really did a lot of work to spread the faith. He sent out missionaries along the trade routes to go to East Asia, where Buddhism would get much more popular. He built these different rock pillars and temples in honor of the Buddha. He gave edicts of his Buddhist manner of rule throughout his kingdom. Again, he sponsored Buddhism heavily, much like the Romans and the Byzantines would later sponsor Christianity. The Gupta, another group that sponsored religion. The Gupta, they were also in India after the Mauryan Empire. They would sponsor Hinduism, a sort of golden age of Hindu culture. And then, of course, in the East, you've got China really becoming more like China than before. You had the Shang dynasty, and they were replaced by the Zhao dynasty. And then you get the concept of the mandate of heaven, that if emperors aren't doing their job, then they can be overthrown, and a new family will be chosen by the heavens to take over. Well, during the latter part of the Zhao dynasty, there was a huge civil war. It's not like it's a smooth transition always. And the winners of that war were the Qin under Qin Shi Huangdi. And Qin was cruel, and Qin was very harsh in his rule. And because of that, he and his dynasty were eventually replaced by the Han dynasty. The Han, big time into Confucianism. Confucianism is going to be important because it really lays the foundation for a lot of what China and its government will become for the next several hundred years. So one big theme is you've got a bunch of empires. Another theme, these empires traded with each other. I'm going to show you a map here in a minute, but you need to know some of the trade routes that are starting to really develop. You'd had Mediterranean sea lanes, trans-Saharan lanes going through North Africa. Especially during this time period, you start to see people bring camels to Africa, which are actually indigenous to the Middle East, and develop camel saddles. It gets a lot easier to trade, from north to south across the Sahara. You've got the Silk Roads. Why did they start? Wealthy Romans wanted silk, so they traded with the Han dynasty in China. Okay, and over time, lots of luxury goods and essential goods get traded along those paths between East Asia and Western Europe. And finally, you've got Indian Ocean trade. As navigation technology is getting a little bit better, more and more people hit the Indian Ocean. But just know that's something that's going to pick up a lot of steam more so in our next time period, the post-classical era. Again, these different groups traded with each other. And all those groups in between, were middlemen. So you're going to see a lot of stuff spreading, some intentional, some not. To kind of service the traders, to act as trade hubs, you see a lot of these empires build, these imperial cities. This is where the government comes from. This is where a lot of the economic activity comes from. Some of the big cities of this time period include Rome, Carthage, Persepolis, Pataliputra, Chang'an, and Teotihuacan. Because there's so many empires and because there's more trade and travel, you have increased cultural and biological diffusion. Luxury goods like silk, new technology, new diseases, and new beliefs. More and more people moving around, trading. You see the birth and diffusion of several major world religions. Now, some of these were born before the classical era, but this is the time period when most of these faiths, most of these belief systems get very large and very widespread. Diffusion means to spread. So you want to see why and where and how different religions spread. A lot of times you look at the trade routes that kind of go through each regions, the areas that were connected. These religions that were born and or spread include Hinduism, Judaism, Buddhism, Christianity, Taoism, and Confucianism. It's important to know how they spread through a combination of trade, travel, proselytizing, more on that later, warfare, yeah, religion can spread through war, and of course, government sponsorship. Constantine with Christianity, Ashoka with Buddhism, the various emperors of the Han Dynasty with Confucianism, the various emperors of the Gupta Empire with Hinduism. Again, it really helps a religion to spread if the leaders of a certain empire can help to kind of enforce that on the populace, or at least encourage it. All right, kids. This video, if it indeed works, is going to kind of show you the birthplace and the eventual diffusion of the major world religions that are so prominent today. You wonder maybe why people in certain areas believe what they believe, why Christianity is popular in some areas, whereas Islam is in others. And you really have to look at who conquered what area, who traded where, who purposely sent missionaries into certain regions. I mean, there's a story there. So please view this. I don't think that it'll work if I try to narrate over it, but hopefully this will give you a better understanding of where these religions start and where they eventually spread. Please note, we're in the classical era currently. And while most of these religions either were born in the classical era or rose to prominence during the classical era, Islam actually comes up in the next time period, the post-classical era. As you watch this, I want you to think about how and why religions spread. You know, they spread through trade and travel. This is an era in which a lot of these great civilizations traded with each other, interacted with one another. A lot of these civilizations were empires, and when they went into a certain area and conquered its people, oftentimes they converted the masses, sometimes willingly, sometimes not. You've got to look at these religions, the ones that proselytize or purposely want to spread their faith. So you look at trade, you look at travel, you look at warfare, you look at governments that sponsor a certain religious belief. That kind of explains the distributions you're about to see. So just watch and enjoy. On this slide, we have a map of the classical empires and states. Uh, we've discussed these previously, but we'll go over this real briefly. Please note, though, you need to remember where these groups were, at least the approximate location. This will be much more important later on when we enter into the official College Board curriculum. Remember, the bulk of this class is the last 800 years, but still, you want to have a decent understanding of geography, where these groups were, because where you live oftentimes determines how you live. So take a moment and just kind of study this. Couple people not to really worry about unless you want to. The Moche in South America, we don't really get into them too much. Phoenicia and its colonies, very similar situation. Phoenicia was in modern day Lebanon. But definitely know the approximate locations of the rest. The Greeks, the Romans. The eastern half of the Roman Empire later becomes the Byzantine Empire. The Persians, the Empire of Alexander, pretty much the same thing. The Moira, the Gupta, we're talking South Asia, India. The Qin and the Han empires, or dynasties, we're talking China primarily. And then, of course, the Maya, you're talking about the Yucatan Peninsula, parts of southern Mexico, parts of Central America. You do need to know the names and locations of these classical era trade routes. The good news is, once you know these, they're the same main trade routes we're going to see in the next time period, the post-classical era, and onward for much of history. You've got your Mediterranean sea lanes, all these different groups around the Mediterranean trading with each other. You've got the trans-Saharan routes. Lots of gold, lots of salt, lots of traversing across the Sahara. Again, camels really helped with that quite a bit. You've got the overland Silk Roads. And I know it says in purple Eurasian. Let's just lump them all together and say the Silk Roads. Was it just silk that was sold? No. But that was the nickname due to, that being one of the first luxury goods that people in the West really wanted to get their hands on. In the West, you had the Romans. In the East, you had the Han Chinese. That's kind of the impetus of this trade relationship. But no, all points and all people in between were involved to various degrees. Lots of things, not all of them good, spread along the Silk Road during these days. And you've got the Indian Ocean routes here in the light blue. Again, connect a lot of the same areas as the Silk Roads, just the coastal areas. This will, as time progresses, become a booming trade route, especially as ship technology and navigation technology gets better. Those are the trade routes to know. Those are our big networks of exchange. No roundabouts, the areas they connect, and obviously their names. Now, I'm not going to go through this whole thing because I've already been recording for quite a while, and you can read this as easily as anyone else. What we have here, though, is a chart that at least gives you an overview of how these different governments were ran. A couple key things I want to bring up: the idea of a centralized, like empire or government, or a decentralized. Centralized means power is all vested in a central government, in this case, usually an emperor. Decentralized just means it's broken up amongst a lot of different areas. The Greeks, the Maya, they were collections of city-states. They were very rarely united civilizations. It was more small, independent city-states that kind of did their own thing. Now, in the case of the Greeks and the Maya, we lump them together because culturally they're very similar, but politically usually independent. I've got some key individuals that you need to know in the next column. Ashoka, big sponsor of Buddhism. Han Wudi, big sponsor of Confucianism in Han China. You get into people like Constantine, that's the irony of the Roman Empire. They crucified Jesus and then years later helped to make it a dominant world religion. Again, we are very concerned anytime a government, sponsors a particular religion, because that is one of the things that help these religions become so widespread. So take a moment to read this over, copy it down if you want. I leave that up to you, but there is some very valuable information here, most certainly. The next few slides are from a series of paintings, the series called A Course of Empire by American painter Thomas Cole. Now, while these are not exactly over any one civilization, you can definitely see them inspired by Greece and Rome. If you look at the architecture and everything else, I would say that those are the areas that really kind of were drawn from as far as inspiration. And what you will see in this painting and the next two paintings, it's the same basic landscape, changing over time. And not only do I like these paintings just because they're very well done, they also can kind of show you the course of a lot of these classical era empires. Kind of their heights and their ultimate downfall. So as we examine these paintings, as we do a little art analysis, I'm going to ask you to pause every once in a while and just look around. The first thing that I would like you to maybe pause and look for is the big kind of rock face that's jutting out in the upper right-hand side of the painting. That rock face, although the perspective changes, is in all three of the paintings that we are going to see. So this first painting, this is kind of the height that a lot of these empires, these classical era empires went through. Again, with increased trade and through military conquest, a lot of these empires got very, very wealthy. Again, luxury goods coming in, resources, the list goes on and on. But interaction with more and more people can eventually bring downfalls. Wealth, and the accumulation of it can breed government corruption. The desire to build these palaces sometimes leads to high taxes, which can lead to civil unrest. In China, stuff like this may lead to people assuming the emperor no longer had the mandate of heaven, the peasants' rebellion. Um, Another thing, though, that happened in most of these empires is they got invaded. When you get to such a geographic extent that you can no longer adequately guard your borders, well, bad things can happen. Again, the same civilization, this fictitious civilization. But this happened to a lot of these groups. I mean, we've all heard of the fall of Rome in 476. Literally, Rome was sacked. Barbarians, which that was just what the Romans and the Greeks called anyone who were outsiders. They obviously had grown tired of what the Romans had been doing, conquering everything they had laid their eyes on. And as the empire got so large that the Romans couldn't really guard their borders, these different groups, people like the Huns and the Goths and the Visigoths and the Vandals, they came into Roman territory and started chipping away at it. And Rome itself was invaded and sacked. Buildings were burned, monuments and statues destroyed. People were murdered. I mean, this is about as bad as it gets. 476, the Roman Empire in the West ceases to exist. All these different quote unquote barbarian groups settle into Western Europe and start carving out kingdoms for themselves. The first few hundred years will be known as the Dark Ages because it's a very dangerous time to be alive. We see this with the Han Dynasty. Peasant rebellions lead to its downfall. We see this with the Moira and the Gupta. Civilizations, I mean, they all have their own reasons for falling. But geographic overextension, civil unrest, peasant rebellions, The spread of disease, these different groups trading with each other, different things diffused that were unintended. Um, Eventual invasion. Again, they all rose, they all fell, and in some areas, they were in ruins. Again, I keep referencing Rome and the European Dark Ages because this is something we're going to get into. But I want you to know there's a reason why it was the Dark Ages. For 1,000 years, Rome had built the roads and the aqueducts and kept the water running, and they symbolized civilization, and then it was no more. And literally, people in Western Europe were growing around the ruins of an empire that came way before them. Again, more on that later. This is really just an excuse to look at the paintings, guys. I like these paintings. They're some of my favorites. So I figured I would show. Last slide, vocabulary. I'll go over this very briefly. You do need to copy this into your notebook. And if you didn't get much notes on the civilizations, that's fine. I know I went through stuff very, very quickly. You can get your notes from the reading after this, as well as the videos on Tuesday. So some key vocabulary to know, to maybe be able to use. Some of this stuff, if you brought it up in your essay at the end of the week, it may help you quite a bit. The first few have to do with religion. Polytheism, essentially the belief in many gods. Through most of history, this is how most organized religions are. Eventually, though, you get monotheism. Monotheistic religions like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, to name a few, they only believe in a single God. To proselytize is the attempt to spread a religious belief and recruit new members of a religion. We've all heard of missionaries. Okay, not every religion does it, but some do actively want to get more and more converts, so they proselytize. As religions travel, they change. They combine with other belief systems. They adopt new characteristics. We call this syncretism. We sometimes see this in art and other elements of culture, but in here we're usually, when we talk about syncretism, we're talking about religions kind of changing and adapting and of course, kind of combining over time. Some religions have monks and monasteries and nuns where people that are very devout can go and live in seclusion and just fully devote themselves to their faith. You see this in Christianity and Buddhism especially. We call that monasticism. You see anything about a monastic lifestyle or anything like that, monastery, that's part of the word, really think monasticism. Diaspora, any large group migration from their country of origin. The Israelites, the Hebrew people of what is now Israel, the Jewish people, adherents of Judaism. They lived in the Middle East for many, many years, but they were invaded. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Romans, and all those invasions, can force people out from their homeland. And especially, after the Babylonian captivity and the sacking of Jerusalem by the Romans, the majority of Jews left the Middle East and actually traveled to North Africa and a lot to Europe, where they were pretty much perpetually seen as outsiders and discriminated against. This is the diaspora. And we wouldn't see a massive return of the Jewish people to the Middle East until the creation of modern Israel after World War II. City-state, a central city and surrounding lands which constituted a small, politically sovereign country. You can tell I got that right off of dictionary.com. This is like the Greeks. This is like the Maya. This is even going back further, like the various groups in Mesopotamia. City-states, think small countries. We oftentimes lump groups of city-states together because of similar culture, like with the Greek and the Maya, but politically, no, they were independent. I mean, in ancient Greece, in Athens, you had a direct democracy, the birthplace of the people having some say in government, whereas in other areas, you might have a straight-up absolute monarchy. Hellenism. You'll see Hellenism, you'll see Hellenistic a lot. This is basically the imitation or adoption of Greek culture in the areas that Alexander the Great conquered. The mandate of heaven. This was talked about earlier, but this is really important. It's the political and religious doctrine used to justify the rule of the Emperor of China. And finally, a kind of random weird word, but you see most empires, most governments throughout history employ this: bureaucracy. The structure and set of rules that control the activities of people that work for a large organization in government. It is characterized by standardized procedure, formal division of responsibility, hierarchy, and interpersonal or impersonal, relationships. Again, bureaucracy, it's a word that's going to come up a lot. We'll go into more depth and detail later on. But for now, if you know that much, you should be in good shape. Once you finish your notes, please complete the brief reading over the classical era. You don't have to do post-classical yet. It is in the same file. We will save that for a later date. Thank you so much.